This week, we'll continue our dialogue about the primary mission of the church, making disciples. Adam Mabry is with us. He's the senior pastor at Aletheia Church, which is a multi-site church with its main campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's the author of Church Forward, Life and Doctrine, The Art of Rest, Stop Taking Sides, and When God Seems Gone. I'm Charles Galda, president of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. Adam, thanks so much for being with us.
I'm really grateful to be here.
And so for folks who maybe don't know you or the Aletheia story, can you give a little bit of a bio of you and who Aletheia is?
Sure. So my name is Adam. I'm the guy who planted Aletheia. We moved here in 2010, and Aletheia started with 9 people in my living room. A few of them sitting on my couch. It's actually behind me over there. That same couch is sort of a monument to what God's done. So the Bible study that started on that couch is now a church with 3, soon to be 4 locations, and our main congregation, or our oldest congregation, was planted about 12 years ago, right in between Harvard and MIT. Started at a Cambridge YMCA, and then moved down the road to our own space. We have 3 services on a Sunday. We've planted a few other churches outside of just kind of the Aletheia imprint, if you like. And from the jump, we've cared deeply about being a disciple-making, diverse, spirit-filled, Bible-saturated church. And by God's grace, He's been unbelievably kind to us, and this has gone kind of bigger and faster and better than I thought it would. Before doing this, I helped plant 2 churches in the UK. Kind of thought I would do that for the rest of my life, and but after about 5 years there, we had the British government changed our visa status, and it ended up being the thing that kind of precipitated our move back to America and our move to the city of Boston. In addition to that, I moonlight as an author and a seminary professor.
And so one of the dynamics I noticed in the Cambridge campus is, because of your geography, is you're very multi-ethnic, you're very young, and I feel like the old guy in the room, and clearly I'm not that old, right? But and you've got this dynamic of people coming and going too, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we are, I know that, so like in terms of like our ethnic diversity, I feel like it's a huge gift. And, over the last few years, I've seen, especially since 2020, exactly how much it is both a gift and a stewardship and a responsibility for us as leaders to not just assume that's the way things are. And so I'm really, really grateful for our ethnic and now increasingly generational diversity as our church has aged, and we've got, layers of folks. But yeah, it also, there's just a ton of turnover. Every May, June, about a third of the people that make up our church pack up and move away. Not because they're mad, but because it's time to go. And so either they're probably about 25% of our church are undergraduates, but everyone in Boston and Cambridge kind of lives on a university schedule. And so internships are ending, jobs are ending. That's when, if you're grown up with a real job, that's usually when you switch it out, especially if you have kids that are in school. And so we find, at the end of May, about a third of our people leave, and we cry and we say goodbye to them, and it's really hard. And then by like August, that same number of people have sort of refilled, and we're back to where we were in May. And then by the end of August, it's a whole new jump in addition to that. And so, I learned the first few years that the relational energy involved in keeping connected with our church required a constant input from me, recognizing that I'm just going to have to say goodbye to a lot of people I care about, and that's part of what it means to do ministry here.
Yeah, and but there is a really big impact to that too, because every 4 years these folks are going back and they're going to be running in senior government circles, major corporations, founding businesses. So that 4 years they're with you becomes really critical to form them because of the impact and the roles they're going to have.
Yeah. That's part of the reason that we care so much about like discipleship, right? Because we're looking at a compressed time horizon with people. We're thinking, okay, in 3 years of preaching and small groups and classes, like what are the most essential, most like vitamin packed things we can give them to really help them, become established in their faith, and then equip and empower them to go engage people wherever they move. And so, it feels like an Antioch kind of vibe where we send a lot of seed to the wind and see where it'll go. But it's it's also been really gratifying and beautiful to hear back from our, alum, if you like, and where they end up in all the amazing things that they do.
Yeah. And so we've been in a lot of these episodes, we've been talking about Gordon MacDonald put a question on our radar screen earlier this year of the most important question we need to answer is, how do we know our folks are growing spiritually? And of course, preceding that question is, how do you grow folks spiritually? And a lot of us don't have good answers to either one of those questions, but you're mentioning why this discipleship is so. Can you talk a little bit at Aletheia? What does it look like? How are you growing folks spiritually? What does disciple making look like there?
Yeah. So our big mission statement that we say every Sunday, and it's kind of plastered all over our walls, is that we want to be a church that makes disciples of Jesus, who bring the truth and the grace and the changing power of the gospel for the glory of God and the good of all people. And so truth, grace, and change are kind of the key elements at every step of our discipleship process, or, I guess in corporate speak, those are like our values. They're just kind of integrated everywhere. So we want to be the most loving we possibly can be, but also the most courageously truthful, and declarative of the gospel that we can be. And we want to be a people that are constantly expecting life change, situation change, can't stay where we are. So whatever we do, those are the constituent parts. And so, we around here, we talk about the 4 E's of discipleship. We want to engage culture and community and individuals with the gospel. And we want to establish people in the faith, and then equip and empower others to go engage people with the gospel. And so what that looks like, much of what we do, I would imagine, looks pretty mundane for anyone that's used to church. We try really hard to preach the Bible as faithfully as possible and create, worship moments that are, Sunday morning liturgical experiences that are both deeply worshipful and also make sense to people who are bringing their friends. One of the things that we've learned is an effective way we can engage people is by constantly remembering every Sunday that someone, or probably a few dozen people every Sunday, are kind of cashing in all their relational chips to invite their friend to church. That they've been waiting and praying, and that's the Sunday that they show up. And so it's on us not to break that trust, and to do a great job of presenting Jesus, and do a great job of, whatever it is that we're trying to do there. And so that kind of keeps our head in the game for Sunday. And so we feel like worship gatherings are both really important to establish and equip people, but also to engage people. We feel that way about small groups too. I know that in some churches I've heard language used we want small groups for community or doing life together. We don't talk like that. I studiously avoid language like that, because I think those are outcomes of great discipleship. I think if we have small groups that are aimed at making disciples, then of course we'll love each other. But if we have a small group aimed at loving each other, then the minute we kind of have to correct someone, it doesn't feel love, it feels not so relational. So Sunday and small groups, both, we say they have to engage people who don't know Jesus. They have to establish people in their faith, and they have to equip and empower folks to engage people who don't know Jesus. And then we have a series of very specific classes that we work hard to measure the outcomes of. You get more of what you celebrate and measure. And so we don't measure things like decisions or things like that. We make a big deal about the number of baptisms, a big deal about the number of leaders and new leaders, new volunteers, or stuff like the people who are making a step, anything that looks like movement. That's what we tend to clap a lot for, and make a big public deal of. We track everything, like everybody probably does, but those are the numbers that we tend to really celebrate and press into, and we think most about between Sundays.
How do you separate in that? And I want to come back and talk about the classes, but how do you separate in that somebody like me who's good at conforming to church norms from somebody who's actually being changed by the gospel?
Yeah, such a good question. This is where there's the qualitative, quantitative stuff. So, quantitative measurements, those are the easiest ones. You just have to figure out which widget you're going to count in which box, and then you do that. So, which is why, we count baptisms and not hands raised or people at an altar or whatever, only because it seems to us that qualitatively a baptism is a much more meaningful, indication of someone's movement toward Christ than, say, an emotional moment on Sunday. Not that those are bad. And so part of it is in what we choose to measure, but then the others are we kind of are constantly going okay, what stories are we hearing? And so when our pastors get together and our leadership team gets together, most of our meetings start with, okay, we're going to take 10 minutes and we want to hear very specifically discipleship stories. Like, do we have any discipleship stories or follow-ups to stories that we heard? And so that's the qualitative part, which is more the art. And you can't really put those in a spreadsheet. But when all of our stories start to sound, the same, or we're all praying for the same sort of thing, that's part of how we hear the Holy Spirit kind of like, oh, this is what God seems to be doing in our midst. Or, oh, this is a gap. Everybody's really worried and anxious right now. Like, what's that mean? And so I think the qualitative stories that we share are a huge way of how we know if we're seeing life change. And then like, there's the big ultimate stuff. Like, is our church multiplying? Like, are our groups multiplying? Are there people who seem to be, stepping into ministry? Those sort of bigger, like toward the other end of the pipeline, if you like, those are really key indicators for us.
And you're talking about the small groups. How intimate does that get? Because we're talking about disciple making there. Almost everybody we've been talking about in the last week on this topic has talked about the need for community to grow people spiritually. And part of that, I think, is that I look pretty decent when I come to church on Sunday and I talk a good game, but you don't see me when I snap at my wife or when somebody cut me off in traffic. And does it get to that level of intimacy where you're in each other's lives enough to see that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. In fact, we oftentimes I hear in kind of small group speak, like, either you can have community and intimacy, or you can like reach people who don't know Jesus, but you can't have both. And like, that's kind of true. I get what we're saying, but I think it's also important when people come into our midst and they're like, that they see real Christians doing real Christian things. Like, our basic assumption is like, if a non-Christian comes to church or comes to a small group, it's probably because they at least want to see what Christians are like. And so, if a non-Christian is coming and they're exploring Christianity, and like, we run certain groups that are for like checking out Christianity. We do, Alpha or Christianity Explorer. We have all kinds of stuff like that. But if they're showing up in a group and they're still kind of not sure where they are with Jesus, we actually think it does them a great service to, say things like, hey, here's where we are in our marriage. We also tell people, like, it's okay to have like concentric circles of closeness within a group of people. Like, if you have 8 to 12 people in your house on a weekly basis, chances are you're going to vibe with 2 of them more than you do with, say, the other, 6 or 8. That's okay. That apparently is what happened to Jesus too. He had his 3 and then he had his 12, kind of goes out from there. And so we just are very much like, hey, we want you to form relationships naturally. And if you get a bestie out of this, great. That's awesome. Just don't be so cliquish that you can't like care about people who aren't in that circle.
Yeah. And so if I'm leading one of these groups, or is there somebody in the group who has an accountability for spiritual growth of the group, or is it more a shared responsibility of everybody? How does that work?
Yeah. So our groups each have a leader and a co-leader, and they usually divide up these, responsibilities. Those like 4 E's and how we measure them actually go into the writing of group materials. So most of our groups roll off of a deeper Bible study of whatever we studied on Sunday. So not just going over my like 3 points that all happen to start with the same letter or whatever, but like, hey, this is the chunk of the Bible we read. Let's read this together. What are our, like our foundations class, we basically, we teach basic, Bible interpretation, observe it, interpret it, apply it. And so we're trying to give them those skills. And when they meet with their group, the section leader is what we call them, but it's like a group coach. The questions they're getting asked are like, okay, are you noticing the people are getting better at reading their Bible? How do their prayers sound? Are they more honest? Are they, what are some of the indications that you're seeing people are really engaging? And another one, honestly, the most obvious one that we find, like when the Spirit is really helping, is there repentance of sin, and do they suddenly care about people who don't know Jesus? Like those 2 questions, like if their hearts are soft and they're starting to realize, oh, God's got to help me with X, and they care about their non-Christian neighbor, family member, colleague, whatever, that's when we're like, okay, this is something really good is about to happen. Because if we care about the people who don't know Jesus and we care about our own holiness, that's a huge part of the
And so
process.
are you, when you talk about repentance of sin in those groups, are you talking about, is there confession of sin or is it something different?
Yeah, I mean, there are moments definitely for that. Many of our groups will, like, in the prayer time, they'll kind of split off into like if there's 12, they'll split off in like little groups of 3, or if it's a co-ed group, they'll often, divide between men and women to pray a little bit more closely and intimately. And as a group matures, there's more confession. Those things tend to happen in like the little triads that I mentioned. But yeah, we definitely want and encourage, like, hey, if you don't confess your sin to one another, how is anybody going to be able to celebrate with you when you have victory? So we try to, we encourage our group leaders to model that. Like, that means you're going to have to be risky and open your heart a little bit. And that's just part of the cost of leadership.
Yeah, we just did an episode with Pastor Susie Silk from Church of the City in New York. She grew up in Connecticut, on talking about confession of sin, the whole episode. And so she was making some similar points. And I was making the point of, we don't know what James meant when he was saying confession of sin. We're confident it was not confess your sins to one another. We just don't know what it really was.
If only he could have been more clear.
And most of us do not have that practice. So it's very interesting to me to hear that you guys are leaning into that, right? Most of us will tailor it to, I'll apologize to you, Adam, when I did something wrong, right? To you.
Yeah.
But I don't think most of us practice, I'm just going to confess my sins to one another, or have the trusted relations to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's sort of why, but when you do that with someone and you invite them in, then you actually get really good community, which is why I've always said, like, if this makes me unpopular in church circles. I hate the phrase doing life together, because life is all you're ever doing. If you're ever not doing life, it's because you're dead. So at any given moment, you're doing life. But I mean, I know what is meant, like, we're living these new regular lives up against one another. But I just find that, hey, if we'll try to be Christians together and go after a mission, we'll be friends. But if we try to be friends, we'll probably forget about the mission and we might not end up being friends. So that tends to be how we approach it.
And so now I want to go back. You were mentioning some classes that you're very intentional about, knowing that a lot of the folks you have for a limited window. And so what are some of the things that you guys have narrowed into and say, these are things we want to make sure people leave Aletheia knowing? Yeah,
the one class we want to make sure everyone goes through is something we call Establishing Foundations. And it is a 12 session. Sometimes it's taught across 12 weeks. Sometimes it's taught across 7. Class that goes through the foundations of faith. It starts with 5. Each chapter has 5 exercises in it, and they're not studies; they're exercises, because they're designed to engage your mind, your emotions, and your spirituality and your body. And so it'll start out with like, okay, now get on your knees and pray this prayer that God would open your eyes. Okay, now read the Bible. Okay, now here's the investigation part. Okay, now what do you need to do in response to that? So it'll do this with you through kind of the grand sweeping narratives of Scripture, and then at points pops out with like, okay, this is the doctrine of God. This is who He is. He's Trinity. This is why that matters. Okay, this is how we're saved. This is the end times. This is what the church is. And it's specific enough that any Christian will feel definitely more rooted, but it's not so specific as to be it's not drilling in like a very neatnik Reformed or Arminian theology, soteriology, or drilling in like a very particular eschatology or something like that. I mean, I'm a mostly Reformed charismatic nerd, so I'd imagine that's probably where it leans because I wrote it. But that one class is the thing we want to make sure everybody gets, because if they leave here having established foundations in the Word and in the church and in the practices of faith, then we feel like everything you can build on a good foundation. But if we got them to serve really faithfully in the church for 4 years and they never did foundations, and they didn't build them because they were too busy working for Jesus to spend time knowing Jesus, then we feel like that we have failed. And we've definitely done that in the past. So
now you made a point that you want to engage their spirit, their mind, their body. Now I'm a Baptist, so my reaction to that would have been, I don't need to kneel to pray, right? Because Baptists just expect everything out of hand,
sure.
right? And
sure.
And so why is it important to engage all of the person that way?
Yeah. If the pandemic taught us one thing, it's that the human body really matters, and that embodied physical presence is a sine qua non of discipleship. I just fundamentally don't think you can make disciples without being in person with people. You can do part of it. Maybe you can hear the word, definitely, and you can have, like, I'm super grateful for technology, definitely not a Luddite. But if it taught our church anything, it was, oh, we have to be together. We have to be together. And that means my embodied, like, physical eye, ears, nose, like, it means something to engage the whole of myself in the practices of my faith. So no, you don't have to kneel to pray, of course, but it's really hard to feel proud when you're on your knees. No, you don't have to take communion every Sunday, but it's hard for me to forget to tell people about the body and blood of Jesus if I do. And so for me, and kind of the way we've built some of these things, these like embodied habits are sacramental in that they're about something other than the habit. So no, of course you don't have to do these things, right? But it's like, I tell my church often, that we tend to think as Christians of like sin and not sin, but there's this whole big wide category in the middle called stupid, or not stupid, right? There's a wisdom piece that's like, yeah, no, it's not sin or not sin if you kneel or don't kneel, like, of course not. But it may be wise to consider what you're doing with your body when you read the Bible, or when you pray, or when Mortimer Adler wrote a book a long time ago called How to Read a Book. And there's like multiple chapters on where you should be sitting and what the temperature of the room should be and how your body posture should be and what you should be, should there be music or not music? And it was all around like, so that you can read well. And I thought, wow, if this level of intentionality can go into just reading comprehension, it's probably the case that we need to engage our physical selves along with all the other stuff.
And that plays very well into what Dallas Willard talks about in some of his stuff about, well, if you want to change the person, you've got to change their thoughts and feelings, and you've got to change their will, and you've got to change their habits of their body. And we try and just focus on the will. And and it's interesting that you're engaging the whole part to try and address that too.
Yeah, we're certainly trying to, right? Like, even in little things like, cognitive behavioral therapy works for a reason, right? Now it tends to be, you can do CBT and it's all works-based, but it'll help you because it conforms to with like the way God made the world. Your thoughts and your body and like your emotions are just all connected. And the church probably is like an outcome of kind of a post-enlightenment, divisionary way of thinking, just focused on the spirit and the supernatural stuff. But the Bible doesn't ever do that. The Bible talks about, I always love to think about Elijah, after his big victory in Mount Carmel, and he's depressed and the Lord doesn't give him a sermon. The Lord gives him a nap and some cake and then tells him to take a walk. And then the Lord talks to him after those like very normal kinds of practices. And so we want our people to understand like God cares about the whole self. And especially like now in a culture that is increasingly Gnostic, like your gender, your body, like all of these are very malleable. Your sexuality, like that's all up here, like in your soulish person. And it doesn't really matter. Like you're sort of a meat Lego. You can do whatever you want with. Christians have to have a theology of the body that's like, Jesus came in a body. Jesus made our bodies. Like, we're going to get new bodies. The world's going to be physically resurrected. Like, there's more to this than just what's between my ears. Like, these things are all intimately intertwined. And so I think in our practices of discipleship, one of the ways we can be very prophetic is by intertwining those things.
That's a great point. At what point, one of the things we've noticed when it comes to spiritual growth is that most of us lay people don't have an idea that it's the spiritual disciplines that are transforming us to be like Jesus. And so at what point are you intentional about that? And at what point does it come up in someone's journey?
Yeah. That's part of why we built the Foundations course the way we did, because we want them to like, hey, don't just sit down on a Friday night before Sunday and do all 5 of these, chapters. They're not chapters. Take a day, like just do an exercise or 2 a day, and if you'll do what it says, it's going to engage you in prayer and meditation and quiet, in reading and reflection. Like it will. We don't call it that the whole time. We're not as explicit as say, a Richard Foster book. But from the jump, we're trying, even from the way we do our like worship services, like we're adding in, which is weird. I was never Catholic, so this doesn't, I'm a I'm more Presbyterian in my background, but we've engaged like confessional habits, speaking the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed, doing communion most Sundays, and all of this in the context of kind of a loud, more charismatic worship experience. So it's kind of weird. But again, it's all formational. It's like, well, but our people need to know how to confess their sin, and they need to know the Apostles' Creed. Every Christian for 2,000 years has known the Apostles' Creed, got to know the Apostles' Creed. So we're kind of taking an all hands on deck approach and feeling like, we live at this wonderful time in church history where we're not really divided. I mean, this is the least denominationally divided I remember things being. I mean, I think we all just want to, especially in New England, we're like, hey, if you love Jesus, I want you to win. Yeah. So I feel very free, and we feel very free to reach back into church history and pull from all of the saints that we can, and build something that works for now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. And I have a friend who would say, yeah, so the denominational boundaries are low in New England because we're 2% of the population, and we're just desperate enough to try doing what Jesus said to do.
There you go. There you go. That's pretty good.
And so coming up on a couple minutes left, what have I not asked you about that you think is an important thing for people to grasp in this conversation?
I think I really believe this, that we are standing in the moments prior to a third great awakening. I believe that God is going to bring renewal and revival to our nation, because I believe the only other option is judgment. And I don't mean that in like a ugly way. I just think like, well, yeah, this looks like we've, unrighteousness is dialed up pretty high. I can't really imagine it getting a lot higher. But when that's happened in the past, God's been really kind to us. And so I would just want a listener to this podcast, if they're a pastor or on church staff or just an engaged Christian, man, I want them to come away with faith that, New England kind of wears you down, right? Our weather wears you down. Our general approach to politeness wears you down. Our, traffic wears you down. Like, it can kind of just wear you down. And I've seen people show up to this place, especially to Boston, with, high hopes. And then, 5 years here, and there's a layer of cynicism that's just grown on them like a moss. And I, chief among sinners myself, but the gift of faith that, hey, God, like, this is God's thing. He's way more interested in his church than any of us are. He delights to save sinners more than I do. He cares about this stuff more. Like, we're on his team, and he wins. Like, all God ever does is win. None of his plans can be thwarted. And in the end, he wins. So what, kind of like, okay, why are you downcast, oh my soul? Like, I want someone's faith to be elevated past like get by faith to like go get after it faith. And that's my, I'm a nerd. I'm academic. I love the Bible. I don't know that we need a lot more of that right now. I think what we need is like just courageous faith to keep being faithful, keep talking to your neighbor, keep praying, keep trusting God for your prodigal, keep praying for your pastors and your leaders and your staff. Of course, they're going to make mistakes. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing, but good thing God does. Like, just let's be people of faith who our default mode is, faith, hope, and love, trusting that God can do something great. That's going to part ways with this cultural, cynical attitude that believes nothing about anything. And I think God really likes that and likes to respond to faith.
Great words to end on. Adam, thank you so much. Thanks for your ministry. Thanks for your partnership. And thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, I'm very glad I got to be.
Same here. Same here. I'd also like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer, and our listeners. This program is created by Vision New England, who wants to help the church make disciples, do justice, foster unity, so we can share Jesus and lives can be transformed. You can find more resources at visionnewengland.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.